What's a historical fact that would shock most people to find out? The ancient Greeks, inventors of democracy, would elect their officials to 1-year terms. Each official's finances were audited at the beginning and end of their term. If anything was amiss, they would be tried and executed. Sharks are older than the rings on Saturn. Woodrow Wilson was mentally and emotionally incapacitated by a massive stroke in October 1919, and his wife and doctors essentially ran the country until Harding took office in 1921. Some historians refer to Edith Wilson as the first female president. The Second Congo War, also known as Africa's World War, was the deadliest conflict since World War II, with over 5 million people killed. Most people have never heard of it despite it ending in 2003. In a similar vein, WWI was only the third deadliest conflict in human history. WWII is first, obviously. Second is the Taiping Rebellion. It held 20-30 million people and 5-10% of China's population at the time. A guy decided he was Jesus' brother and led a revolt. There were religious and ethnic cleansing all over on all sides, and the capital even fell to the rebels at one point. It was the most fucked up conflict most people have never heard of. It took about 4 times longer to get from copper swords to steel swords than it took from steel swords to atomic bombs. The first vehicle created by humans not powered by animals or the wind, i.e. sailing ships, was the train, and it took something like 300,000-ish years to go from no powered vehicles to trains. Then it took about 100 years to go from the first powered vehicle to the first powered flight. It then took another 58 years to go from the first powered flight to the first human in space. It took 8 years from that to put the first human on the moon. Sharpshooter Annie Oakley had a stage act where she would shoot a cigarette out of someone's mouth. While she was touring Europe, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany surprised everyone on a whim and insisted on holding the cigarette. Ever the professional, Oakley shot the cigarette without harming the Kaiser. Several years later, WWI is underway and the US goes to war against Germany. Oakley wrote a letter to Kaiser Wilhelm asking if she could have another try at that shot. He didn't reply. The Great Papago Escape. The Allies had POW camps for German soldiers. One of those camps was in Arizona. On the night of the 23rd of December, 1944, 25 Germans tunneled out of Camp Papago Park, near Phoenix, Arizona, and fled into the surrounding desert. The German plan was to escape by rafts on a nearby river. They dragged their rafts with them and escaped into the desert, only to find the map was showing waterways that only existed during the monsoons. They had to walk back to the camp to avoid dying in the desert. Today Papago Park is a popular tourist attraction, but there is no sign of the camp or tunnels. Escape to where? Exactly. Most POW camps in the US had very little security. A lot of POWs were actually allowed to work on farms and such nearby, including walking unguarded to and from work. Some made friends with the locals and would go to dinner at local residents' houses. This was all allowed because they couldn't really go anywhere, even if they ran. North America is huge. As far as we know, John Adams is the only founding father of the United States that never enslaved anyone. A lot of people think of the founding fathers as a bunch of old guys with white hair. Wearing white wigs was the fashion of the time. They were actually relatively young. Monroe was only 18. Burr was 20. Hamilton was 21. Oldest was George Washington at 44. There was only one monogamous emperor in Chinese history, the Hongzhi Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He apparently invented the toothbrush to impress his wife. I think when most people think harem, they think of a couple of hundred women, but ancient Chinese harems could get crazy. There was one emperor in the Tang Dynasty who had like 40,000 concubines. A lot of lower ranking concubines never had sex with their emperor and never even saw him. I heard that Wu Zetian, only female emperor, Had like 5,000 male lovers and it drove the traditional nobleman insane, but I can't find any sources for that lol. During World War II, the United States military developed a plan to use bats as bombs. The idea was to attach small incendiary devices to bats and release them over Japanese cities at night. The bats would then roost in buildings, and when the devices detonated, they would start fires, causing chaos and destruction. While the project, known as Project X-Ray, never saw combat, it's a bizarre example of the lengths to which military strategists were willing to go during the war. During the training of the bats, some were accidentally released with the devices attached. They did exactly what we wanted them to do, roost and then set fires in hard to reach places. Unfortunately, those places happened to be the Carlsbad Air Base in New Mexico. Also kind of funny that this happened so close geographically to the Manhattan Project going on at the same time. I feel like somewhere, at some point, you had the following conversation between two government officials. So what's going on out there in New Mexico? Are you talking about the large collection of some of the smartest scientists and engineers on the planet, all in lockstep to develop a terrible weapon the likes of which this world has never seen? Or the guys duct taping bombs to bats and setting their own base on fire? When the SS Britannia went down in the South Atlantic, a raft of survivors managed to get away. According to the men on the raft, there was one more survivor on the raft with them. But he was unfortunately pulled under by a giant squid, which then returned and attacked their lieutenant named Cox, who they managed to save before scaring the beast away. Their claims were called out as preposterous and made up when they returned home, until Lieutenant Cox got sick of being accused of such and went to see a local marine biologist at a college. The biologist validated Cox's claims as he had scars 1/4 inches in size, which definitely belonged to a 23 feet long squid. It is believed that this story is the only known substantiated report of death by giant squid. The year 536 was deemed the worst year to be alive. Volcanic eruptions caused prolonged dark sky for up to 18 months. This then caused a mini ice age, crop failures and plague over the next 10 years, killing millions. Also, the name Tiffany has been in use since the 1600s. Approximately 8% of Canadians were enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force during World War I. That isn't 8% of eligible Canadians, or 8% of Canadian men, that's 8% of the entire population of Canada. If a similar proportion enlisted in the United States today, there would be 26 million people serving in the US Armed Forces. Grenade Island, Scotland, had been the site of a clandestine attempt by the UK during World War II to weaponize anthrax, a deadly bacterial infection. The exact details of what had happened there would only come to light when in 1997 the government declassified a film that the military had shot at the time, which detailed the experiments. In 1981, an environmental group called the Dark Harvest Commandos landed on the island and took samples of anthrax-infected soil. They left a bucket of that soil outside Porton Down to highlight the deadly contamination on the island, aiming to force the government to do something. The Battle of Keran Sebs. During a war with the Ottomans, the Austrian army of 100,000 men were camped around the town of Keran Sebs. A contingent of hussars crossed the nearby river to scout for Ottomans, but didn't find any. They did find a bunch of Romanian villagers who sold them barrels of schnapps. A bit later some of the infantry arrived and demanded some of the schnapps. The hussars refused and made a makeshift fort around the barrels. A fight started and one of the infantry shot their rifle. This caused panic and the Romanian infantry shouted "Turci, Turks!" This caused both groups to flee into a panic into the camp, screaming "The Turks have arrived!" The army, composed of Austrians, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, and Italians, didn't speak the same language. So when they saw a bunch of infantry and hussars running through the camp, some thought it was a cavalry charge. An artillery officer gave the order to start shooting the cannons. It didn't help that a German officer was shouting "Halt" in German and everyone thought it was Allah. The camp awoke thinking they were in the middle of battle. Legend has it that it resulted in 10,000 deaths, but modern scholars think closer to 1000. This so thoroughly demoralized the Austrian that they withdrew. 2 days later the Ottomans arrived, finding a field of dead and wounded soldiers, and easily took the city. Constantinople, and thus, the Roman Empire, fell in 1453. There is a 16th century Spanish explorer named Juan de Fuca who is credited with exploring the strait that borders Vancouver Island, Canada, and Washington, USA, now called Juan de Fuca Strait. Juan de Fuca is a Hispanicization of the Greek name Ioannis Phocas. His grandfather fled Constantinople and his family eventually ended up Spain. This means an actual descendant of the Roman Empire was exploring North America. Generals Grant and Lee did not meet at a courthouse in Appomattox to sign a treaty to end the American Civil War in 1865. They met in a private farmer's house at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. Many people seem to think the Cuban Missile Crisis ended when the Russians backed down in the face of Kennedy's steely resolve. In fact, a settlement was negotiated where, in return for the withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba, the US agreed to withdraw its missiles from Turkey and to never attack Cuba. What even fewer people know is that Kennedy and Khrushchev found a way to communicate directly without any interference. Kennedy went around the State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA, and Khrushchev went his Defense Ministry and Foreign Ministry, and they communicated via a back channel. This happened well before the Cuban Missile Crisis. Apparently, neither of them trusted their governments. Kennedy was killed in November '63, and Khrushchev was removed a few months later. May make you wonder. A military plane carrying 2 nuclear warheads broke apart and crashed in North Carolina. The state would have gotten nuked if it weren't for a single safety switch preventing detonation. These nukes were bigger than the ones we used in Japan. Read up on the 1961 Goldsborough B50 to crash. I'd like to point out that the single safety switch wasn't as precarious as it sounds. It was a low voltage switch that was defaulted in the safe position until the pilot flipped a different switch in the cockpit only after they got the confirmation that the use of a nuclear bomb was authorized. It gets mentioned because safety precaution 1, the safing pins in the arming rods, were ripped out in the crash similar to how they would have been removed by the crew prior to real drop. This pin removal started the first step of the firing sequence, which is to activate the internal generator of the bomb. The flow of power from this generator was ultimately blocked by the aforementioned safety switch. So essentially, a safety mechanism built into the bombs performed as expected. The 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan killed around 200,000 people. Before that, Imperial Japan killed 30 million in East and Southeast Asia. And those are only the statistics of war crimes. Not so core of them. Related, the United States has not minted a new Purple Heart since WWII. We are still awarding Purple Hearts from the stockpile we made in anticipation of a full-scale invasion of mainland Japan. The British Pet Massacre. In 1939, about 400,000 cats and dogs were killed in order to prepare for World War II food shortages. This was approximately 1/4 of the pets in England. The Mexica Aztecs didn't actually believe the Spanish were gods. That story was made up after the fact as the conquered Mexica struggled to understand how their civilization fell to whom they perceived as barbarians, the Spanish. The Mexica conceived that it was the will of the gods that their glorious city fell. The diseases and plagues that the Spanish brought must have been divine punishments as well. The Mexica themselves overthrew more advanced civilizations to take over the Valley of Mexico, so they figured it could happen to them eventually. And the Spanish were more than happy to go along with this story. The rest is history. During WWII, Juan Pujol Garcia pretended to be a Spanish government official so he could become a pro-Nazi spy for Germany. Little did they know that Garcia hated politics and had no intention of helping them. They stationed him in Britain, where he ran a network of 27 fake people that the German government funded entirely. Whenever there was a mistake or problem, he'd blame another fake agent. He eventually contacted the USA and told them about his little scheme he's running. They saw the value in this and contacted Britain, who used him as a double agent. Britain helped Garcia increase his intel output to the point that his network seemed so big that Germany stopped sending new agents to the country entirely. His intel was key in the success of the invasion of Normandy. By sending true intelligence that was delayed, Germany believed he had insider information about it that was 100% true. He then gave them the right time for the attack, but the wrong location. As a result, many of Germany's forces were moved away from the actual target. By the end of the war, Garcia had wasted over $300,000 of German resources and countless hours of running down fake intelligence leads. Not shocking but pretty interesting. Took a history course on the history of pirates and smugglers from ancient times to modern piracy. Vietnam was historically a pirate's haven because the landed elites of China had bought up all the land and started to monopolize rice production and price-fixed rice to the point no one could afford it. So about 1 million people who were pushed off their land living on boats decided they had enough and sailed to Vietnam, where they teamed up with the local population to create a black market rice smuggling operation which angered the elites and Emperor of China. The Royal Imperial Navy was sent to destroy the smuggling fleets. But the Imperial fleet got embarrassingly defeated every single time. So this is why Vietnam has always been a challenging place to occupy, because Vietnamese people have a long heritage of expert maritime skills, are well versed in guerrilla tactics, and a battle-hardened characteristic. For hundreds of years, they had to defend against much more powerful nations, historically China, Japan, France, and eventually the US. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin reached out to the American embassy in Switzerland and requested to meet that evening. The spy he spoke with, Alan Dulles, said he was unavailable that night and tried to push the meeting to the following day. Lenin insisted he would be on a train the next day, so the meeting had to be that night. Dulles, the future director of the CIA, did not want to cancel his plans that night and insisted the meeting had to happen the next day. Lenin got on the train, and the meeting never happened. Who knows what Lenin wanted to meet about, but one can see better relations between the USSR and America had the two men met and developed a working relationship. What we do know is why Dulles refused to meet with the man who would soon become one of the most influential people of the 20th century. He had a date with Swiss twins lined up for that evening, which he deemed more important. Dulles was a nepotism hire and more concerned with living the James Bond version of a spy's life than actually doing spy work. Oops. Wright's brothers' first flight was 1903. First warplane 1911. 8 years we went from discovering flight to using it for war.